So welcome to another installment of the CRMA's ongoing series, Grant Wood in Focus. In the series, we continue to look at the museum's most famous artist through different lenses and consider him from different angles. And today, as you can see from this slide, we're going to look at his series of paintings of Indian Creek and consider them in their art historical context. So just to begin, I'm not going to go through Grant Wood's whole bio, but he lived in Cedar Rapids from 1901 when he moved here with his family as a 10-year-old until he moved to Iowa City in 1935. Many of his most important works were inspired by the people and surroundings of the city. His depictions of Indian Creek, which runs through Cedar Rapids and neighboring Marion, show up over and over throughout the 1920s. The CRMA has 6 confirmed pieces of Indian Creek and 9 total likely candidates, although 3 of these titles do not confirm where the scene was painted. These works were painted between 1920 and 1929. We know of several more examples in private collections, so it shouldn't be assumed that 9 is the max number of this series. These Indian Creek paintings all showcase Wood's early Impressionist style with their dappled light and virtuoso brushwork. So from the top left to the bottom right here, we're looking at basket willows, leaning trees over Indian Creek from 1920, landscape near Indian Creek, 1923, amber, Indian Creek, fall, 1927, the bottom row, Indian Creek, 1927, Indian Creek, 1929, and Indian Creek, summer, also from 1929. These slides show what we consider to be probable Indian Creek landscapes. Again, from left to right, this is landscape with tree from 1923, fall landscape 1924, and Iowa afternoon also from 1924. Impressionism is one of art history's most famous movements, and most people know enough about it to know that it began in Europe, specifically in France. Wood first traveled to Europe in 1920, visiting Paris with fellow artist Marvin Cohn. Excuse me. However, at this time, he was already familiar with Impressionism, as it had been one of the dominant artistic styles in America since the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He returned to Paris in 1923 to attend the Académie Julienne, and again in 1926, where he had his first gallery show. While abroad, Wood familiarized himself with the origins of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, but he rejected the more modernist radical styles such as Cubism in his own paintings. So what I want to do with this talk is to give context to Wood's Indian Creek series and place it within the history of art, both as an Impressionist set of artworks and specifically as an Impressionist series. To begin, so like much of the art world, American painters of the late 19th century were stunned and startled by the dazzling colors and vibrant brushwork of French Impressionism. Yet by the century's end, Americans would be amongst the most passionate devotees of the Impressionist style. The American iteration of Impressionism adopted the French artist's bright colors and loose, visible brushstrokes to capture the beauty of everyday American life. Whether capturing the natural world or unique urban energy, the American Impressionists broke with the traditional expectations of academic art to usher in the first popular modern art movement in the nation's history. In Paris, the first of the 8 Impressionist exhibitions, initially called the Société Anonyme des Artistes, Painters, Sculptors, Graveurs, etc., was held from April 15th to May 15th, 1874 at 35 Boulevard des Capucines. The Impressionist exhibit constituted a dissenting and independent gambit, and its participants were not allowed to submit works to that year's Salon. Although this was not such a risk, the Salon jury had rejected most of the submissions by artists like Monet in the late 1860s. The artists exhibiting in this first exhibition had come together in a rough group some years earlier. In the early 1860s, 4 young painters, Claude Monet, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Alfred Sisley, and Frederic Bazille, met while studying under the academic artist Charles Glare. They discovered that they shared an interest in painting landscape and contemporary life rather than historical or mythological scenes. Following a practice that had become increasingly popular by mid-19th century, They often ventured into the countryside together to paint in the open air, but not for the purpose of making sketches to be developed into carefully finished works in the studio, as was the usual custom. By painting in sunlight directly from nature and making bold use of the vivid synthetic pigments that had become available since the beginning of the century, they began to develop a lighter and brighter manner of painting that extended further the realism of Gustave Courbet and the Barbizon school. A favorite meeting place for these artists was the Café Jourbois on the Avenue des Clichés in Paris, where the discussions were often led by Edouard Manet, seen here on the left, whom the younger artists greatly admired. They were soon joined by Camille Pissarro in the center and Paul Cézanne, seen here on the right. Impressionism got its name from Claude Monet's painting Impression Sunrise, exhibited in 1874. Art critic Louis Leroy accused the work of being a sketch or impression and not a finished painting. It demonstrates the techniques many of the independent artists adopted: short, broken brushstrokes that barely convey forms, pure, unblended colors, and an emphasis on the effects of light. Rather than neutral whites, grays, and blacks, Impressionists often rendered shadows and highlights in color. The artist's loose brushwork gives an effect of spontaneity and effortlessness that masks their often carefully constructed compositions. This seemingly casual style became widely accepted as the new language with which to depict modern life. In addition to their radical technique, the bright colors of Impressionist canvases were shocking for eyes accustomed to the more sober colors of academic painting. Many of the independent artists chose not to apply the thick golden varnish that painters customarily used to tone down their works. The paints themselves were more vivid as well. The 19th century saw the development of synthetic pigments for artist paints, providing vibrant shades of blue, green, and yellow that painters had never used before. Paint was also now available in tubes, which allowed artists to bring colors outside with much greater ease. Before the paint tube was invented in 1841 by portrait painter John Gough Rand, artists or their assistants previously ground each pigment by hand, carefully mixing the binding oil in the proper proportions. We're looking at Camille Pissarro's Landscape at Chaponval from 1880 and Berthe Morisot's Woman at Her Toilette from 1875. The independent collective of Impressionists had a fluid membership over the course of the 8 exhibitions it organized between 1874 and 1886, with the number of participating artists ranging from 9 to 30. Camille Pissarro, the eldest, was the only artist who exhibited in all 8 shows, and Berthe Morisot participated in 7. Ideas for an independent exhibition had been discussed as early as 1867, but the Franco-Prussian War intervened. The painter Frederic Bazille, who had been leading the efforts for such a show, was killed in the war. Subsequent exhibitions were headed by different artists. Philosophical and political differences amongst the artists led to heated disputes and fractures, causing fluctuations in the contributors. The exhibitions even included the works of more conservative artists who simply refused to submit their work to the salon jury. This is Paul Gauguin's Vision of Jacob Wrestling the Angel from 1888 and Paul Cézanne's Mont Saint-Victoire with Large Pine from 1887. Paul Cézanne and Paul Gauguin, whose later styles grew out of their early work with the Impressionists, also participated in these independent exhibitions. Impressionism's many facets and varied participants make the Impressionist movement difficult to define. Indeed, its life seems as fleeting as the light effects it sought to capture. Even so, Impressionism was a movement of enduring consequence, as its embrace of modernity made it the springboard for later avant-garde art, both in France and abroad. One of those places abroad was America. After the end of the Civil War in 1865, the United States gained unprecedented international political and economic status. American art patrons, notably Northerners who had made their fortunes from the war, traveled abroad and imbibed European culture. To announce their wealth and sophistication, they built grand houses like those seen here and filled them with imported decorative arts and paintings by old masters and contemporary academics. To appeal to prospective patrons, aspiring American artists felt the need to study in Europe, particularly in Paris, to truly complete their artistic education. Soon after, Americans began to earnestly collect and emulate European art. The French Impressionists made their debut in a private exhibition in 1874, as we discussed. They showed together 8 times in total until 1886. Rejecting the academics' devotion to invented subjects and meticulous technique, Impressionist painters depicted landscapes and intimate scenes of everyday middle-class life using natural light, rapid brushwork, and a high-keyed palette. Young Americans in Paris in the 1870s, studying with academic teachers, largely ignored Impressionism, and the few who took note of the radical style were appalled. After visiting the third group exhibition in the spring of 1877, painter J. Alden Weir wrote to his parents, quote, "I never in my life saw more horrible things. They do not observe drawing nor form, but give you an impression of what they call nature. It was worse than the Chamber of Horrors." There are 2 exceptions to the American disdain of Impressionism during its early years. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania-born Mary Cassatt, seen here on the left, who moved to Paris in 1874, was sympathetic. Her work attracted the attention of Edgar Degas, who in 1877 invited her to exhibit with the group and became an important part of her artistic life. Another exception to this initial American dislike was John Singer Sargent, seen here on the right. Sargent was born in Florence, Italy, to expatriate American parents, and by 1874 was studying in Paris, where he met Claude Monet 2 years later and was inspired by him and his colleagues to paint lively urban scenes. Unlike Cassatt, Sargent was not a fully fledged Impressionist, but he had an important impact on the development of the movement as a conduit of new ideas from Paris to friends and colleagues in the United States. His own style mixed elements of Impressionism with more traditional academic portraiture. During the 1880s, as French Impressionism lost its radical edge, American collectors began to value the style, and more American artists began to experiment with it after absorbing academic fundamentals. This is Thomas Cole's Last of the Mohicans from 1827 on the left, and Martin Johnson Head's Thunderstorm on Narragansett Bay from 1868 on the right. Impressionism in America built upon the examples of landscape painting practiced by the earlier Hudson River School, exemplified here by Thomas Cole, and the tonalists, exemplified by Head, particularly in the emphasis on immersion in the natural world and an attention to light and color. The Impressionist interest in everyday life, modernity, and commonplace scenes, however, marked a difference from the transcendental visions of earlier 19th century American landscape painting. Both of these we can see here emphasize great wildernesses and the sublime nature of the outdoors. Exhibitions of Impressionist works were held in American cities and sales were strong. In 1886, with a series of brilliant images of New York's new public parks, artist William Merritt Chase became the first major American painter to create Impressionist canvases in the United States. One of these works is what we're looking at now. This is Mrs. Chase in Prospect Park from 1886. At about the same time that Impressionism became more popular, Americans began to visit artist colonies that centered on outdoor painting, most notably Giverny, where Monet had settled in 1883. Those who saw inspiration there included John Singer Sargent, Willard Metcalf, and Theodore Robinson, who transmitted Monet's ideas to his compatriots back in the United States. By the early 1890s, Impressionism was firmly established as a valid style of painting for American artists. Even the previously horrified J. Alden Weir was a convert. The slide on the right is J. Alden Weir's The Factory Village from 1897. And it's opposite Childe Hassam's Surf Isle of Shoals from 1913. Most of the repatriated American Impressionists lived in the Northeast, tapping into the cultural energy that was increasingly concentrated in New York City. Some of them taught in the new art schools that were a consequence of the growing professionalism Others conducted summer classes dedicated to Impressionism, as Chase did on the east end of Long Island from 1891 to 1902, and as John Henry Twachtman did in Coast Cobb, Connecticut during the 1890s. Impressionists in both Europe and the United States witnessed the transformation from an agrarian to an industrialized urban society. They were simultaneously excited by change and nostalgic for the reassuring and familiar past. This is John Twachtman's, excuse me, John Twachtman's Horseneck Falls from 1900 on the left, and Edmund Redfield Overlooking the Valley, 1919 on the right. While some American artists adopted only the surface tenets of Impressionism simply to accommodate collectors' evolving tastes, many of them shared the French Impressionist conviction that modern life should be recorded in a vibrant modern style. Their works, like most of their French counterparts, appear to be infused not only with light and color, but with meanings inherent in the subjects they depicted. Some artists, like painter Edmund Redfield, were especially dedicated to painting en plein air, even in adverse conditions. In high winds, Redfield would strap his canvases to trees and paint in knee-deep snow, determined to finish the painting in one session. As Impressionism spread across the United States, different areas began to develop their own regional variations of the style. One of these prominent regional variations of the style was California Impressionism, exemplified here by Benjamin Chambers Brown's Poppies, Antelope Valley, painted before 1942, and William Keith's Carmel by the Sea from around 1905. The California Impressionists depicted the wide variety of California landscape, the foothills, mountains, seashores, and deserts of the interior and coastal regions, and reached its peak of popularity in the years before the Great Depression. These artists gathered in colonies in places like Carmel by the Sea and Laguna Beach, as well as in cities like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Pasadena. While Impressionist influenced painting remained popular in California well after it did in Europe or the eastern United States, as the Depression worsened and newer, more modern styles became accepted, the movement fell into decline. A similar fate was given to Midwestern Impressionism. Many Midwestern artists, including Grant Wood and Marvin Cone, both of their works seen here, worked in the Impressionist style into the 1920s and 1930s. Like the French Impressionists before them, Wood and Cone concentrated on intimate scenes and small vignettes, as opposed to the wide bird's eye view landscapes that they would later become known for. Now let us turn to considering the history of series of paintings of the same location. Wood's Indian Creek series isn't of the same view from the same vantage point, but still constitutes a series that can be considered as a whole. Prior to 1869, I am not aware of any artist who painted a series of landscapes. It was common for painters to produce several studies, perhaps sketched en plein air, in the course of preparing for a major studio work, but those were not intended to be a series of paintings of the same motif for the purpose of representing them together. By the 1890s, 3 Impressionists had painted a substantial series: Claude Monet, Camille Pissarro, and Alfred Sisley. This did not happen out of the blue, nor did 2 copy an idea from the third. Prior to their first formal series, each had painted very similar views of the same motif on more than one occasion, and sometimes painted 2 or 3 almost identical views of the same scene. However, these had changed from being short, informal series, which might have just happened that way, into formal exercises in which the painter deliberately returned to the same viewpoint and painted the same motif under a range of weather conditions at different times of day and under different lighting conditions. The best known example of a series is perhaps Monet's Haystacks, painted between 1890 and 1891. The earliest series that I can find in Monet's work, actually, is that of Manipur et Etretat from 1885 to 1886. As you notice, this series is painted from several different perspectives, although the distinctive rock formation of Etretat is always in view. Although Camille Pizarro did not attempt a proper series until 1892 when working at Bazencourt, as we see here, he built a loose series of the road to Louveciennes between 1869 and 1872. Alfred Sisley followed a similar course with a loose series built around Saint-Mamet in 1884 to 1885, and a much tighter series for which he is best known, the church at Moray-sous-Loing from 1893 to 1894. Each artist began with loose series initially. However, the conscious decision to paint a tight series seems to have first been made by Monet in 1889, following which both Pizarro and Sisley decided to paint their own. No doubt a major influence on them was the huge commercial success of Monet's grain stacks and his series of Rouen Cathedral. So perhaps we find our most direct parallels to Wood's Indian Creek not in these more strict series, but in the looser ones like Louveciennes and Saint-Mamet. Let's follow it up with another example of a loose series, Degas' racehorses. Degas loved to be seen amongst the French elite, and where better than the new horse racing scene. It also provided inspiration for a major strand of his work. The Longchamp racecourse, in French, the Hippodrome de Longchamp, is a 57-hectare horse racing facility located on the Route des Tribunes at the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. The first race was run at Longchamp on Sunday, April 27th, 1857, in front of a massive crowd. And this is actually a Manet painting of a race at Longchamp about a decade later. The Emperor Napoleon III and his wife Eugenie were present, having sailed down the Seine River on their private yacht to watch the third race. A number of prominent artists painted horse racing scenes at Longchamp, including Edouard Manet, this painting from 1867, and later by Edgar Degas. Recent advances in photography had shown the range of improbable postures that the galloping horse adopted. These photographs intrigued Degas, and he set about incorporating them into his horse racing paintings. The Hippodrome was an occasion to study the raw animal power of the horses and the attractive clashing colors of the jockey's silks. And so here we have Carriage at the Races from 1870, Jockeys from 1881, Race Horses from 1885 to 1888, The False Start from 1860, and At the Races from 1870. The CRMA's collection of Indian Creek paintings is, like Degas', a looser series, not a repetition of the same scene like Monet's Rouen Cathedral or Sisley's church at Moray-sous-Loing. Like Degas, Wood painted these works over a decade, not from the same vantage point, but from a variety of positions. Sometimes Indian Creek is visible, and sometimes its presence is only implied. Taken together, we can see Wood's interest in the laciness of tree branches and leaves, the dappling of light at different times of day, the differences in the flora of Iowa's changing seasons. My personal favorites are Amber, Indian Creek, Fall 1927, and Indian Creek, Summer 1929. I think these are Wood's most successful evocations of place, involving both light and texture. In both works, Wood has gone back in with the back end of his paintbrush and etched lines into the thickly painted surfaces to create depth and dimension. Wood's early Impressionist works rarely get the attention that his mature art does, but I hope this inquiry into the context of these early series has shown that they are definitely worth a closer look. So thank you so much for being here. Does anyone have any questions about anything? Well, if not, thank you all so much for sharing your Sunday with me. I hope you enjoyed it and it taught you a little bit more about Grant Wood. So thank you so much, ladies. Oh, one question. You know, I have read Nan's book. We have archives of Grant Wood. He never specifically says, I just assume that it still is one of the loveliest places in Cedar Rapids. And now you can go to the Indian Creek Nature Center and they have beautiful paths that you can walk along. So it still is one of the most beautiful, unspoiled natural places in Cedar Rapids. And certainly about 100 years ago would have been even more so, much more rustic than it is now. So I think he was purposefully seeking out kind of some unspoiled nature that was as close to hand as he could get it. Of course. Thank you all so much for being here.